Now, what other information do we have about the changes in Russia that cast aspersions on their sincerity? This courageous woman, Yevgenia Albats, wrote this book a few years ago called called The State Within a State, the KGB and its hold on Russia, past, present, and future. In this book, she outlines the deceptive nature of the changes in Russia. How after the '91 coup, when Yeltsin took charge, people were more guarded in their phone conversations. There was more of a sense of the police looking over people's shoulders. She even writes that at Moscow News, where she was a reporter, they hired KGB agents, put them in the newsroom where they could look over her shoulder. You see, she was the reporter who exposed the information that the $1.5 billion given by the West for Russia to disarm its nuclear warheads was used to build a chemical weapons plant in violation of the treaty they signed with George Bush. So obviously they want a KGB agent to be in the newsroom. They'd want to find out who was leaking that information to her. Here's what she writes in her book. There had never been any real question of disbanding the Committee for State Security, KGB. Oh, a bit of patching had to be done, not so much for the benefit of the Russian public, which was much too busy looking for bread, that hungry autumn there wasn't a loaf left by noon, as to dazzle the West. And it worked. You see, you get the tune? It's a carefully staged play. The purpose is to dazzle the West. Boris Yeltsin has cirrhosis of the liver because, like many actors, he has a drinking problem. He is not the head of the USSR or Russia, or the Russian Republic rather. He is up there to play a role. Another Russian wrote an interesting book. He wrote another book I'll tell you about too. Andrei Navrazov. I've had the pleasure of speaking with him. And this book, The Coming Order, outlines the whole idea of the deception to get the West to disarm. Andrei's father, Lev Navrazov, was Stalin's favorite translator from English to Russian. So Andrei grew up in a privileged home. In the neighborhood that he lived, Andrei Gromyko, the longtime foreign minister, lived there. He had all kinds of bigwigs at his home. They'd talk around the kitchen table, and he said that as a boy, he heard talk of this democratization of Russia in the future. He heard them discussing it. And when he was, it was interesting, he came to this country when he was about a high school senior age, and he went to a private school, I think it was back east, and one of the young American boys there said, in America, we have something called the freedom of, the pursuit of happiness. And Andrei looked at him and said, well, in the Soviet Union, we have something called the hydrogen bomb. And that about sums up the essential cultural difference here, the difference in perspective. Andrei writes in his book, The Gingerbread Race, about the Western elite, Skull and Bones, all those folks, the New World Order crowd. And what he says is they're like the gingerbread man. They have all this money, this technology, and all this arrogance that goes with it. And they believe that no one can catch them, that the dictatorships in the East can't possibly match wits with them or match guns with them. Well, he said, like the gingerbread man, they're going to climb onto the nose of the fox. See, run as fast as you can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man. It doesn't work, because eventually the fox is there and he gets you to go up on his nose to cross the river and he gobbles you up. And that's what Andrei says is going to happen to the West and to Skull and Bones and the New World Order. It's food for the communists, who are much more sophisticated in their preparations. Andrei Navrazov writes in The Coming Order, the bitter truth before us then is that the free Soviet press has been allowed to focus on internal failure, that is in Russia, because this justifies the new course of super détente. It has done a good job not because the KGB managed the deception from one day to the next, but because the Soviet civilian economy has been in a state of collapse since 1917, just as the Soviet strategic infrastructure has prospered since 1917 and, since 1963, achieved nuclear parity with and then superiority over its NATO adversary. The current transfer of science and technology will render that superiority irreversible. That is the sad truth, ladies and gentlemen, of what's going on today, and Andre put it very succinctly. And here's one of the categories of weaponry that they are preparing in. We signed a treaty with them to get rid of chemical weapons. They're one of the three main weapons of mass destruction. There's biological, there's chemical, there's nuclear. Well, here's the chemical. And what did they do to circumvent the treaty they signed with George Bush? Besides using the money earmarked for nuclear weapons to build a chemical weapons factory, they've developed a new kind of chemical weapon, A232. It's binary. That means that it consists of two elements, each one harmless on its own. But when you bring them together, they're as lethal, it is as lethal as VX gas, one of the most lethal nerve agents known, which is in itself many times more lethal than sarin gas. Now, why did they make it in this form? Why make it in binary form? Because, you see, they can get around the arms control inspections that way. They can create it as if it were an industrial chemical, stockpile it, warehouse it with industrial chemicals. And the inspectors will go, oh, no, there's no poison gas there, that's just an industrial chemical. It's a witting attempt to fool us, to deceive us in a very crucial area. What about biological weapons? U.S. asked Russia to show it has halted on its biological warfare program, military suspected of treaty violations. Some of you may have remembered that when Boris Yeltsin first took control in Russia, he came over to America, and Barbara Walters interviewed him. Now, Boris Yeltsin's from Sverdlovsk in Russia. That's where he was party boss at first. And Sverdlovsk happens to be the center of anthrax manufacturing in the Soviet Union. In fact, in 1979, they had an accident there, 7 years after the 1972 protocol prohibiting the manufacturing of biological weapons. An anthrax factory had an explosion, and a huge cloud of the stuff was released. Lucky for Sverdlovsk, the wind was blowing away from the town, and only 1,000 or 2,000 people died in the countryside instead of hundreds of thousands of people in the city. Now, Barbara Walters had done her homework. She knew that Yeltsin was from Sverdlovsk. She knew that there was no evidence that they'd stop this again, so she confronted him. And she said, Mr. Yeltsin, you're still making these biological weapons. What are you going to do about it? And Yeltsin said, I'm going to go back and fix it. You know, we're not going to do this anymore. Well, several months later, Marshal Shaposhnikov, the head of the Commonwealth of Independent States military, was confronted by a Western journalist who said, Boris Yeltsin did not keep his promise. You are still making this dangerous biological material. And Shaposhnikov, in the spirit of the new Russia, said, yes, you're right. Those dirty rats down there, they're renegades. They're not following orders. We're trying to control the situation, but we're going to have to be firmer. Of course, every 6 months, it's the same cycle. And defectors come out telling us that they are working on a super plague virus, something that's immune to any kind of treatment, that instead of having to breathe 8,000 spores to become infected, only a few dozen spores will cause infection. When you prepare for nuclear war, as Marshal Sokolovsky and his theorists pointed out, you have to build underground, because everything on the surface of the earth is vulnerable to these massive nuclear weapons that we have today. Here we have the story from the Orange County Register. Russia constructs vast underground complex in Urals. Now that's just April of last year. They are building a city under Yamato Mountain the size of metropolitan Washington. And it is riddled with rail and road tunnels. Why? Why is it riddled? Because Russia has been producing these new road and rail mobile ICBMs. And they can hide hundreds of these things underground in these tunnels and in this underground city. They also will not allow any Western arms control inspectors or officials to go down there to see what they are doing. They could be breaking any treaty. Imagine signing a treaty with someone and saying, oh, well, you can't look there to see if we're cheating. They're cheating, ladies and gentlemen, just like they cheated on the chemical weapons They're cheating on the nuclear weapons too, and on the biological weapons. And Yamato Mountain is all part of it. One of the other reasons that mobile ICBM launchers are significant, you may remember at the beginning of the Gulf War, our intelligence thought Saddam Hussein only had about 50 Scud mobile missile launchers. You know, all the satellites that we have and all the reconnaissance planes, and that's the best we could do. It turns out he had 250 or more mobile launchers. But because these things are so difficult to keep track of, even by the sophisticated space intelligence systems we have today, we underestimated him by a factor of 5. Now the same thing goes for the Soviets. Only they have a territory, the former Soviet Union's territory, is 50 times larger than Saddam Hussein's territory. That's 50 times the space into which to hide these mobile launchers. It's not just Yamato Mountain, though. Russia is riddled with nuclear-proof towns, bunkers, cities, and tunnels. In 1955, the Supreme Soviet passed a law saying that all new places of work, all new residences, that is apartment buildings, had to have not only a fallout shelter, but a shelter with blast doors and tunnels leading to the subway system or other communication systems and to where the water and food was being stockpiled. And as for food, you probably read in the papers how they've had a bad harvest this year and they're begging the world for help. The fact of the matter is, a couple of years ago in the Wall Street Journal, it was published that the former Soviet republics have 362 million metric tons of grain stockpiled in these underground nuclear-proof bunkers, towns, and cities. That is enough to feed the population of the former Soviet Union for 3 to 5 years. And that does not include the tens of millions of metric tons put away for the Soviet Army. Now here's another article from last year on this same, this one wants to slide, same subject. Moscow still building nuclear defenses. Under the Remenki district in Moscow, they're building a new nuclear-proof town. Now, this goes right into ABM defense. William T. Lee, recently an official with the Defense Intelligence Agency, has made the statement. In fact, he wrote a book. In the book review I read recently on the internet, he wrote a book on the ABM treaty fraud. And he said that the Russians currently deploy 10 to 12,000 anti-ballistic missiles around their country with 18 battle management radars. Now this is fantastic. How did they get away with this? What they did is they made their anti-ballistic missiles look like surface-to-air missiles. When the CIA first noticed them deploying these things many years ago, they did a study to determine what kind of missiles they really were. And the CIA, of course, as always, erred. They decided that they were only surface-to-air missiles, not ABMs. And the fact of the matter is that Lee has found evidence to prove that they are, after all, ABMs. Now, why doesn't this surprise us? They cheat on the biological weapons treaty. They cheat on the chemical weapons treaty. Why not on the ABM treaty? In fact, the START treaty, START stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START 1, they have told President Clinton that they will not meet the 2003 deadline for when they have to have their arsenals built down to like a 2/3 level. Okay? Well, the United States is ahead of that program. We're already practically there. Well, when President Clinton heard this, that they weren't going to be able to make the deadline, he said, okay, you got 4 more years. Take your time. Now they can just, with the kind of leadership we've got now, they can just violate right out there in the open. Now, besides from all this cheating, there's also some stealing going on. You know, you can, what is the saying? You can lock your door against a thief, but you can't lock your door against a liar. U.S.-built computer missing in Russia. Perhaps you read in the paper recently the Cox Committee has found that Clinton has been giving supercomputers to China. Well, apparently they've been giving them to Russia too. And what else? What better to make nuclear weapons with or to hone those 18 battle management radars. But it doesn't end there. Russians cling to dream of nuclear earthquake weapon. That's bizarre, isn't it? They've got all these nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Why do they need an earthquake weapon? Well, it's pretty simple, ladies and gentlemen. See, the United States has a few deep bunkers and tunnels, too. Not very many, certainly not enough to put the whole population of the United States underground, like the Russians can do with their urban population. But we do have some places they can't get out rather easily that are tunneled down. And what better way to get at those places than with an earthquake weapon? You see, they've covered all the bases. When I was with Stanislav Lunev a few weeks ago in Washington, he pointed out to me that they have a weapon more sophisticated than this one. This one is you explode a nuclear bomb on a fault line and it triggers a earthquake down the fault line some days or hours later. He said they've got something that emits some kind of a frequency wave of some kind, like a Tesla weapon. You put it down on the ground and it emits these waves through the Earth's crust and can trigger earthquakes. Now, he didn't know a lot of specifics on it and he couldn't really comment on it. He just heard about it. Now, are the Russians our buddies? Do they love us? Do they hate us? Do they dream of wiping us out? Here's evidence of their hostility. This happened last year. This is from Bill Gertz's column in the Washington Times. Russian laser burns U.S. officer. Maybe some of you remember reading about this. There was an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine leaving our port up there in Washington, and following close behind it was a little Russian fishing boat. And that little Russian fishing boat had a whole mass of antennas sticking out of it. And a Canadian helicopter thought this was rather intriguing. So the Canadian helicopter, with an American naval officer on board, decided to get up close and take some photographs of the antenna array on this fishing boat, this Russian fishing boat. Well, the fishing boat fired a laser beam at the Navy helicopter and blinded two naval officers, one Canadian and one American. If it had blinded the pilot, the helicopter would have crashed. Now that's hostility. What happened? The Navy forced the boat, the Russian boat, into Tacoma and was going to search it, but the Clinton administration objected to a rigorous search of the vessel. Eventually, the boat was allowed to go. There is drunken Boris, able to crack another joke at our expense. He says, it says, Yeltsin says Russia to halt production of nuclear subs. There's a great promise. Hey, did they keep it? Let's look. 3 years later, August of 1995, Boris made that promise in 92. 3 years later, it says here that Russia is continuing to produce nuclear submarines at the same rate as they did during the Soviet era. In fact, they are modernizing their submarines and making them qualitatively superior. I'll just give you an idea of their superiority in one class of submarines. Today we have 18 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. That's our ballistic missile submarine fleet. They have 42 to our 18, almost 3 times the number. Now granted, ours are better, except that if they attack us first, they might get some of our better submarines, especially when they're in port or in their submarine bunkers. But 42 to 18, that is astonishing for a country whose leader has recently promised an end to the production of submarines. And here's from the London Times. New Russian subs outsmart Royal Navy. The British are getting afraid. They're worried. These Russian submarines are hard to track. The new Akulas, when they tested them a year ago last summer, under the thermal layer, they could not be detected. This makes them as formidable as our Los Angeles class. Now, there was something I got to back up a bit. It's kind of interesting. We passed over it. Here we're back to drunken Boris again. Now notice, underneath, there's another article. It says, attorney says Honecker double used in court. What's this? Erich Honecker was the dictator of communist East Germany. And when East Germany collapsed and went into West Germany, they arrested him And they charged him with manslaughter for those people who fled across the Berlin Wall. Well, it's kind of interesting. According to this article, one of the prosecuting attorneys stood up in court and pointed at Erich Honecker and said, "That's not Erich Honecker. That is a double." And a week, 2 weeks, 10 days later, they dismissed the case for reasons of health, because Honecker was suffering from cancer. It's very interesting indeed, these tricks that are constantly being played on us. Now we get back to China and the one clenched fist and the Sino-Russian alliance. China builds nukes that put U.S. at risk. The Chinese are aiming, according to a recent CIA report, most of their nuclear missiles and bombs at us, their trading partner. They want to blow up their best customer. You know, then what would happen? You couldn't go to Lecter's and get that electric toaster that you like so much at such a low price, made from gulag labor. No, the Chinese have been in cahoots with the Russians since the beginning. When I was with Colonel Lunev again, he emphasized to me that the Chinese strategic rocket forces are completely a creation of the Russian military-industrial complex. And that's just the beginning. In fact, this month or next month, they are sending an aircraft carrier. The Russians are giving an aircraft carrier to China. What great buddies. And as I mentioned before, they are sharing intelligence at all levels. The new Prime Minister of Russia, Yevgeny Primakov. This little item came when he was appointed foreign minister. Before that, he was the head of the foreign intelligence part of the KGB. In other words, he's a KGB general. The country's being run by a KGB general. I mean, the government's being run by a KGB general. And what is so special about him? What is so significant in terms of what's about to happen? He speaks fluent Arabic, and he's close friends with Saddam Hussein. And when he was foreign minister, he spent a lot of time flying between Iraq, Iran, and Syria, forming up an alliance to destroy Israel. Now, it's very sinister that he has been made head of the government, because it's the green light to those radical Arab and Muslim states that your man is now in charge over in Russia. And we're going to back you now 100%. You can count on us. And you can see how the situation is heated up in Afghanistan. The Russians, you see, they never really got out of Afghanistan. In the 80s, they inserted an Uzbek corps under command of Abdul Rashid Dostum. And they stayed behind when the Soviets pulled out. They declared themselves first mercenaries, then Islamic. And they kept fighting against the holy warriors, the Islamic warriors in Iran. Now that they've started to lose, despite support from Soviet-built bombers in Tajikistan, they're calling in the Iranians. Iran has massed combat brigades on the Afghan border. And Russia, according to Colonel Lunev, is creating 2 new military districts that stare down on the Middle East area. The Volga and the Urals military districts are being split. That is, they're carving new ones out of those. Now, when you create a military district, you set up the staff, the generals, the officers, for entire armies. To create new military districts there suggests the intention of deploying large armies into South Asia and the Middle East. Now, one last interesting comment. This is what made me head for the hills. Russia's nuclear weapons are on permanent alert. It's from a year ago last summer, the Orange County Register. And what it basically says is that because Russia's spy satellites don't work anymore, and since they can't see our missile bases, the activity there, whether or not we're bringing our missiles up to a higher state of readiness, they've got to keep their missiles at a high state of readiness all the time. They've got to be ready to launch in a moment's notice, because they can't see whether we're getting ready to launch. In an era in which the Cold War is supposedly over, they're afraid of us launching a surprise nuclear strike against them? and they're so afraid they're willing to put their entire arsenal on a hair trigger? You see, if you're going to launch a surprise attack on the United States, you have to bring your missiles up to a higher state of readiness. And you have to have a plausible excuse for doing so. Because normally during the Cold War, if the Russians brought their missiles up to a higher state of alert, we would match it, because we would not want to be caught off guard. You can't just push a button and make these rockets go up. They're spaceships. They leave the Earth's atmosphere. They travel through space. They have heat shields on them to re-enter the atmosphere and hit their targets. They're very sophisticated weapons. You have to make certain preparations to get them to launch. And this is what they have done. And we have bought the excuse, the lame excuse, for getting this thing ready. It is an extremely dangerous situation, ladies and gentlemen. And I think that we should look around at our country and enjoy what we have while we have it, because we may not have it for that much longer. Those people over there have dug out shelters. They've created a vast ABM system. And not only that, next month they are launching a very bizarre satellite, a satellite that supposedly can reflect an energy source 10 times brighter than the full moon. The reason, here again, it's like the Mercy missiles, the reason for this energy source is to substitute for street lamps in cities in Siberia. It's a light source. But what's really interesting about this light source is that if the satellite launch is a success, if the test works, they're going to launch hundreds of these things. Now here's a country that can't afford to put up street lamps, but it can put up hundreds of satellites to substitute for them. I would say we have another problem here, ladies and gentlemen. They're probably about to deploy their own SDI. And those satellites may be directed energy weapons. I don't know that for sure, but their behavior, the pattern of Russian deception and behavior, raises my suspicions. Well, what we come to now is the Soviet nuclear offensive. Okay, the deception strategy has played itself out. We have disarmed ourselves. We are in a position of vulnerability. They are in a position of nuclear superiority. Now, how do they use that nuclear superiority? What is it that they're able to do with it? And here we come into what the Russian generals themselves have said in their many works. At home I have the Russian Officers' Library, which has been translated by the United States Air Force. And it tells us what they think. This is a representative book. This is by an American analyst who goes over what they say. Joseph D. Douglas Jr. wrote this. It's the Soviet nuclear offensive. But let's look at what some of the generals have said about a nuclear war. There is profound error and harm in the disoriented claims of bourgeois ideologues that there will be no victor in a thermonuclear war. This is what we believe in America, that you can't win a nuclear war, that nuclear superiority is meaningless because we have enough nuclear weapons to kill everyone on the planet many, many times over. Well, it so happens that that sharp knife in your kitchen could slit every throat on Earth many, many times over. But everyone has to bare their throat. The fact of the matter is that there are, in countries like Russia and China, underground bunkers. 1,000 feet down, you can't destroy that with a nuclear weapon. There are anti-ballistic missiles. There may be particle beam weapons that can stop some of these. And then there's also taking the hits. It's been estimated that a full-blown attack on America, you could have 100 million or 60 million or 30 million people survive. You still would have a country. You still would have a world afterwards. Besides, these weapons are not made to wipe out all life on Earth. They are made to gain a military victory. And in the hands of generals, that's how they would be used. Generals are not exterminators. You don't fight a war just to kill all the enemy soldiers or population. You fight a war to conquer the enemy country. Now here's another quote. The assertion that nuclear war will not be a continuation of politics is completely fallacious. That's General Jariev. Okay? Clausewitz said that war is politics by other means, by violent means, a continuation of politics. And that doesn't change with nuclear weapons. So you have a bigger bomb, you kill a lot of people, or you blow up you make some big smoking holes in the ground. It's still war, and it still accomplishes your goal. In fact, there's a seductive element here, because you could, if you wanted to, change the map. You could change the population density of areas, the amount of people who speak a certain language. You could force people to immigrate out of certain regions. It's got real possibilities in terms of changing things around. The armed forces of the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries must be prepared above all to wage war under conditions of the mass use of nuclear weapons. Very typical statement. How many of you have heard an American general make a similar statement? You won't. It's politically inexpedient here. You won't hear them say it. This is volume 2 of Peter Vincent Pry's 1992 work, The Strategic Nuclear Balance and Why It Matters. Or Why It Matters is volume 1. This is Nuclear Wars, Exchanges, and Outcomes. Pry goes right to this question of whether or not it matters if country A has so many thousands more nuclear warheads than country B. And he says, yes, it matters very much. And he explains the mechanics of nuclear war, how you fight one, how you go about winning one, from the perspective of an American analyst. And he's aware of the Soviet literature. He's aware of what they are saying. And in this book, written in 1990, he uses the force levels that existed then. That is, the number of bombs and missiles we had then and that they had then. And what he says is that they had, in 1990, a decisive advantage. They had nuclear superiority over us. Okay? They had an advantage, but could that be translated into a meaningful military victory? Now, his book, his whole analysis could be reduced to this chart. Now, I'll go over the cones, starting with the blue cone. The blue cone, which measures 400 estimated megatonnage, that would be the necessary response by the United States to fulfill the mission of mutual assured destruction. Okay? In the 1960s, the Pentagon determined that if we could hit Russia back with 400 megatons after they hit us, that would be unacceptable to them, because it would effectively kill 25% of Russia's population and 75% of their industry, at least at that time. Now, at that time, they did not have the extensive underground sheltering that they have today. And so some experts estimate that at best we could kill 11% of their population, which would be comparable to, which would actually be less than what they lost in World War II, like fighting Hitler. They won World War II, losing about 30 million people, and 27 to 30 million people, and they could win World War III doing the same. But that's mutual assured destruction. You know, minimum, we got to hit them back with 400 megatons. Now, when Peter Vincent Pry goes through the models of war and how they would begin, he has a best case, worst case, and moderate case. And that's what the red cone is. The red cone is what he sees as our best case in 1990. If the Russian surprise attacked us, he felt the best case we'd be able to shoot back with 308 megatons, which is more than 90 less than what you need for mutual assured destruction. The moderate case, it's less than 100, and the little yellow splotch there is worst case. We don't have anything to fire back with. They get us in one sweep. Now, how does this nuclear surprise attack work? How do the Russians achieve it? Besides the deception strategy, what are the technical particulars? The main thing is through microwave weapons, electromagnetic pulse, and the use of submarines near targets. I mean, a submarine missile rises from the sea. The submarine could be positioned right near the target if it's a coastal target, and it would hit the target before anyone could physically do anything. It would just be a matter of seconds. That's all the warning you would have. So, but the main thing is to create this confusion, 30 minutes, 30, 40 minutes of confusion through attacking early warning systems, through microwave weapons, electromagnetic pulse, and anti-satellite weapons. You blind the satellites. A directed energy weapon might be able to fulfill this goal. Now, it's interesting, 30 or 40 minutes of confusion. I would suggest to you that we have had 6 years of confusion in this country, and that our current president has put his exclamation point on this confusion with his recent remaking of our nuclear policy, that we will only launch a nuclear strike when our ground sensors detect the explosions actually occurring on our soil. Now, in a coordinated attack, this would be disastrous because the Soviets could time their missile strikes so that they would land at once. And once they've landed on our missile silos, on our submarine bunkers, on our strategic bomber bases, and our nuclear weapons storage facilities, it's too late. And this is what Pry assumes. He says, look, we just don't have the infrastructure to avoid the confusion at the outset of a nuclear attack. We're going to lose, he says, there's no way. We're going to lose all our ICBMs, the ground-based ones. We're going to lose our submarine bunkers and the submarines that happen to be in port. We're going to lose our SAC bases, and anything that gets out of those SAC bases is going to be shot down by that huge missile array that they have around their country and whatever other defensive weapons they have. And so what Pry says is the red cone. See, that red cone is if every one of our ballistic missile submarines on patrol is able to fire back. Okay? That's what the red cone is. And it's less than the 400 estimated megatonnage of mutual assured destruction. Because you see, of our 18 Ohio class, for example, that we have now, 6 to 9 of them are in port or in bunkers at any one time being refitted. Only half to a third of them are at sea. So you see, that takes care of quite a few of that force. But this is if all the ones at sea survived. Now the green cone is if they can get some of our ballistic missile submarines. And of course, the yellow one is if they can get all of them. Now Pry suggests, he suspects they might be able to get at least where the green cone is. Because there is a technique for attacking ballistic missile submarines successfully. And he goes through it in his book, and it's not something classified. It's something that anybody can figure out, and the Russians have known this for some time. How many of you know that a ballistic missile submarine, when it moves, no matter how deep under the water it is, it leaves a wake on the surface? Now that wake doesn't show you exactly where the submarine is, because the wake actually is way behind the submarine. But it gives you an approximate idea of the location of the submarine. Now these wakes that these submarines, when they're way under the water and when they move, they create on the surface, it turns out that there may be satellite technology that can detect these wakes. And the Russians may have this technology. Now, that does you no good if you want to launch a depth charge or a torpedo attack on the submarine, because it's much too imprecise. The submarine could be some miles away from this wake. However, if you use ICBMs, if the Russians use their nuclear missiles as depth charges, a 1 megaton charge or greater exploded in the approximate vicinity of the submarine. It is estimated the shock wave that it would create would crush the hulls of all submarines within 18 kilometers of the blast. Now Pry goes over this, and I forget what the exact megatonnage of the warhead would be. I'm not sure it matters. They could also sprinkle the area with a MIRV warhead and cause this destruction. So it is possible to attack our ballistic missile submarines by this more indirect method. It's rather unconventional, but it is known. So the idea that these submarines are invulnerable is not absolutely true. Now this is what Pry says about the 3 scenarios in his book. He says, in all 3 scenarios, worst, moderate, and best cases, judging from military outcomes, a nuclear war would probably result in a U.S. surrender. An unconditional surrender cannot be ruled out and may even be likely in the worst and moderate cases. Then he continues, the USSR's post-exchange strategic advantage probably would enable it to continue fighting a nuclear war. The United States, having lost or spent all of its nuclear forces, would be reduced to resisting with conventional weapons. The West must lose. Now, nuclear war for the Russians, when I was with Colonel Lunev, he said something interesting. He said, you know, with the Russian General Staff, a nuclear war is not just simply an exchange of nuclear weapons. It doesn't end there. And of course, this is what books like Soviet Military Strategy are about. They're about how you send motorized rifle divisions and parachute divisions into the enemy's country. And they make rapid advances, and they go to capture strategic locations. You don't destroy all the targets with nuclear weapons. You leave less strategic targets for the tanks and artillery and conventional aircraft to take out. And so it's an invasion. It's a total attack, a nuclear blitzkrieg with all the elements of the World War II conventional weapons backing up the nuclear missiles. And I will get into that in a bit. But some of you may have some real doubts that this nuclear war thing is realistic, because you've heard about nuclear winter and you've heard about fallout destroying all of the survivors. So I want to discuss these doomsday scenarios, these end-of-the-world kind of idea about nuclear weapons, and show you what a fiction it is. This is from Pry's book. He says, subsequent analysis of TTAPS. TTAPS was the study that came up with this nuclear winter idea, and the S in TTAPS is Sagan. The letters represent the initials of the scientists' names. Subsequent analysis of TTAPS have not supported its findings. Russell Seitz of Harvard University's Center for International Affairs has traced the history of nuclear winter research and found that the trend has been, as climatological models have improved, to predict less severe nuclear winter effects, and finally to discredit the phenomenon altogether. Now, he talks about another source. Starley Thompson and Stephen Schneider, the authors of the NCAR study on nuclear winter, wrote the epitaph for this latest apocalyptic theory in the summer 1986 issue of Foreign Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, to create a nuclear winter effect that they're talking about, you would need a hydrogen bomb the size of the Empire State Building with more nuclear weapons-grade material in it than exists on the entire planet Earth, and it would cost more than the gross domestic product of all the countries of the Earth put together to build it. Nobody would ever have any reason for building such a weapon, and nuclear winter is not a real threat. Now let's talk about fallout. There are two kinds of fallout, long-term and short-term. You've all heard about the long-term kind. That's the real scary fallout. Those are those particles like cesium-137 and strontium-90 that stay around, have a half-life of 1,000 years or so, that stay around a long time and can get into the food chain and can cause all kinds of damage. Well, I've got news for you. These particles have been around us for generations. What a nuclear war does is it adds more to the mix. It adds more of these particles in. In fact, those old bombs that we used to blow up before the hydrogen bomb was invented, they were fission bombs. They were not very efficient in burning up all their fuel, and they were very dirty in terms of these long-lived isotopes. In fact, in the studies that I've read, from the above-ground nuclear testing of fission bombs, there has been more of these contaminants, these isotopes, long-term, put into the atmosphere than would be put into the atmosphere from a full-blown hydrogen bomb war. Now, I'll give you an idea. Yes, leukemias and cancers went up in the 50s and 60s. Because there were more of these particles floating around, people breathed them or got them into their food, and they did develop cancers from it. But it's very rare. It's unlikely that you will pick up one of these particles because they get so spread out. And your body has to go through a process to absorb them. Now, the Australian government did a study on what the long-term fallout hazard would be for the Australian population. And the study was rather shocking. They found that after a general nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere, worst case, and of course these long-term particles would go all over the world, it determined that the cancer rate in Australia would go down, not up. Now, of course, there would be an increase in leukemias and lung cancers, a slight increase from the fallout, from the long-term fallout. But there would be a huge decrease in cancers because the importation of tobacco from America would be curtailed as a result of America being bombed. So that gives you an idea of really what the long-term impact of these isotopes are. Now, you don't want to eat food from a ground zero impact crater, you know, and you don't want to You don't want to graze cattle there. You know, you're going to have to be a little bit careful about some of the areas that these long-term contaminants will be in. But overall, it is, you can cope. The survivors can cope with this hazard, just as we cope with many pollutants and hazards today. The real danger of large-scale extermination comes from short-term fallout. Now, it says here that this is a misleading fallout map. It turns out that all fallout maps that you will see or have seen are misleading except for one. And the only fallout map that is not misleading is the fallout map that is drawn up from looking at the Russian war plan. Because this short-term fallout is created only by ground-bursting nuclear weapons. If you air-burst the weapon, there is no short-term fallout created. Now, the short-term fallout, what happens is the fireball of a hydrogen bomb is 10 times hotter than the surface of the sun when it first ignites. And if it ignites at ground level, the particles, the matter it comes in contact with, it alters it, and it makes it radioactive. And as the fireball carries this up, you know, heat rises and the fireball rises, the wind blows it downwind, and that dust from that fireball, it settles downwind. And it is very hot. The levels of contamination from this dust, well, 450 rentigens is a lethal dose in a 24-hour period. Now, you could survive that dosage, but it would take you 6 months to convalesce from it. But we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of rentigens an hour in terms of exposure of anyone above ground in this kind of intensive fallout immediately downwind of a ground burst. Now, let me show you what the United States would be hit with if every single political and military target in the USA were hit at ground level. Pretty bad, huh? Most of the eastern part of the country would be a desert. These radiation levels are so intense they would kill most plants. Now, the state of Maine and upper New York would be spared, parts of the Carolinas and Virginia, and parts of the South and Florida, and larger sections of the western United States would be spared. But let me tell you something. The Russians would not use their weapons in this manner. And there's a number of reasons they would not, very practical reasons. First, this is ground bursting the weapon. You get a less chance for a direct hit on a time-sensitive target like a missile silo. See, guys in missile silos won't be killed by fallout. It doesn't matter. You can generate as much fallout as you want over our missile silos. The guys down there are underground, and they'll be okay. You got to get a direct hit. And what Peter Price says is that actually, with the new guidance systems, the rockets are so accurate that the best chance of a hit on a nuclear missile silo is to actually airburst the missile above the silo. That gives the best chance for a hit. Now, this is contrary to what most experts have been told and believed in this field for a while, and people who have not kept up on the literature don't realize this is the case. Now, there is a very important reason why the Russians would not want a ground burst as well as the accuracy reason on the missile silos. You see, rockets are not 100% accurate. They're only 70 to 80% on their chance of hitting the target. And so you want to chase down each target with more than one rocket, but you know, you've got a limited supply of these rockets, so you don't want to overdo it. So what you do is you send your bomber pilots in, and they can visually spot which targets have been taken out and which haven't. But you see, look at these clouds of radiation. 2,000 or more rentigens an hour. A bomber pilot flying through those clouds through the Dakotas, he would be killed within 30 minutes of contacting one of those clouds. He would start to lose motor function, perhaps within 7, 8, 9 minutes of flying through this cloud. He might not be able to deliver his target. He certainly would not make it back to Russia alive. Now, they do not want to lose valuable bombers or bomber pilots running them through these radioactive clouds. And they have to send their bombers to make sure they've gotten everything. So that is a very practical reason they will not do this kind of an attack on the United States. The other reason is that making the entire eastern part of the United States into a desert might make the usefulness of the land not as great as it would otherwise be to them. The killing off of so many plants would cause changes in the soil, would cause a disastrous erosion in the ensuing rains, and it would be extremely expensive to try to replant and reforest all these areas. Now, there are certain targets they do have to ground burst attack, and those are things like the nuclear submarine bunkers, like off the Oakland Bay Bridge in the San Francisco Bay Area, nuclear weapon stockpiles. Now, they could drop paratroops on some of these places and capture them intact, but there are some of these targets that they do have to ground burst. Bremerton, Washington, San Diego, the Bay Area, and so you see these smaller clouds make more sense. And there will be some ground bursting in some of the, against some of the command bunkers. And things that are really deep down, remember, they have the earthquake weapon as well that they can use. If they wanted to kill us without killing all the plants and destroying the environment in the immediate area with the short-term fallout. Now, this short-term fallout goes away in 14 days, 13 to 18 days. So this fallout that I'm talking about does not last a long time like the long-lasting fallout. This stuff goes away, and your troops can go through it, and basically you're okay in it. This map here shows the areas that, given a ground bursting everywhere, the areas that would be safe. And of course, the only absolutely safe area is the double crosshatched area that is shown in Northern California and Southern Oregon. That's the only place that the wind patterns just won't blow any fallout into that area at all. You don't need a bomb shelter if you live there. But every other area, there are different probabilities. Wisconsin has some chance of missing some fallout. Same thing with some areas of Nevada and Utah. And you can see there's other little zones that have a chance of avoiding it. But so if you want to be 100% safe, you want to live where I live in Eureka, California. But if you can build some kind of shelter, emergency, or a small one, it's a good idea in the other areas of the country, because you don't know exactly, since you don't have the Russian war plan, you don't know exactly where the ground bursts are going to happen. Now, saying that, I want to mention biological attack. If they want to kill the population, rather than ground bursting and causing fallout to kill us, they'll use biological weapons. And the most effective kind of biological attack on America is called polar outbreak. Okay? And it would mainly affect the Great Plains area of the country, the area that's flat. Biological weapons don't work particularly well in mountainous areas or areas where you have unstable air movement. Now, polar outbreak happens in winter. It forms in northern Canada. It is a cold air mass about 1,000 miles in length, about 6,000 feet thick, and a few planes could seed this air mass with, let's say, anthrax. Okay? I think it's the most effective biological weapon because it can stay around for up to 60 days. This cloud within the cold air mass moves at 20 to 25 miles an hour down onto the plains. Okay? And it basically fills up most of the eastern part of the country, east of the Rockies, and then it exits the eastern seaboard with 3,000 feet of thickness remaining. Now, it is believed that one of these attacks, a third of the people in the path of the polar outbreak cold front would inhale enough particles to become infected. And anthrax is highly fatal, pulmonary anthrax, the kind you breathe. The first symptom is you think you have a cold. On the second day, you may feel a little better, and on the third day, you die, typically. And your lungs fill with fluid, and if you don't suffocate, you burn up with the fever. Now, they could make a number of these passes in winter. The reason also that winter is the best time for one of these attacks is sunlight degrades the biological weapon. So colder weather, less sunlight is always better. Now, some details on the attack, the invasion of North America. The Russians and the Chinese have done some curious things. The Chinese in particular. Through front companies, the People's Liberation Army has attempted to establish itself in various ports, both on the Gulf Coast and on the west coast of the United States. Some of you have heard about the controversy now in Long Beach. The People's Liberation Army, through a front company, has been officially granted the right to control the port of Long Beach. but local citizens have protested, and it's going through a kind of litigation process now. But why Long Beach? Well, if you've ever been to Long Beach, California, you'll realize that it is the center of petroleum oil refining on the West Coast. And if you want to project military power, particularly tank and motorized rifle divisions, into the interior of North America, you need to capture these refineries intact if possible. Now, Panama Canal is an interesting thing. William Bright Marine, a Panamanian presidential candidate, recently publicized the event that the Chinese People's Liberation Army, through its front company, and also a front company it jointly owns with Chinese intelligence, managed to, through bribing Panamanian legislators, get this Panama Law No. 5 passed, which gives them control of the ports of entry on either side of the canal, and also promises to hand over to them the American military bases when we leave those military bases at the end of 1999. Now, it's most sinister. Why does China want to control the Panama Canal? Why does she want Long Beach? Why does she want certain strategic ports in the Gulf? I would suggest to you the model of Hitler's invasion of Norway. It's very interesting. When I met with Colonel Lunev, I got to ask him about the Norway invasion. Now, Colonel Lunev is very precise, and when you come to hear him speak, he will correct us all in our getting whatever it is wrong that he said. But one of the things I asked him was, when he studied in their war colleges, were they interested in the Norway operation that Hitler launched? And he said yes. And I asked him, I said, what was significant about the Norway operation? And he said, the Brandenburg Regiment. Well, what it was is that the Germans had pre-stockpiled, pre-positioned stockpiles of arms in Norway before the war. And then when they realized that they were going to invade Norway, they sent troops dressed as tourists into Norway. And these troops then rendezvoused at a given time to these secret arms caches, put on German uniforms, grabbed the weapons, and there you had a regiment on Norwegian soil. Like magic. No Normandy-style beach invasion. No bloody climbing up through the barbed wire, just right there behind enemy lines, a full-blown military unit. Now, the other thing the Norwegians did, the Germans did in Norway, was what was called the Trojan horse. General Fuller writes about it in his History of the Second World War. The Trojan horse was that the Germans had a very good trade agreement for their merchant ships with the Norwegians. Their merchant ships could call on any Norwegian port with the 24-hour notice. This is the identical agreement, by the way, that we have with the Chinese today. The Chinese merchant ship can call on an American port, and within 24 hours we have to allow it to dock. Now, what the Germans did in 1940 is that instead of loading their merchant ships with merchandise, they loaded them with troops and sent them to the normal ports that they usually conducted trade in. When the German merchant ships reached the ports, they opened up, and the soldiers came out of the merchant ships, seized the ports and the heavy offloading equipment so they could offload their artillery and tanks. It's very interesting that control of port facilities and the agreement the Chinese have with us give them a similar kind of opportunity. And I would suggest that a crisis in which the Chinese may be preparing to invade Taiwan, some of the ships that they load may get in the shell game switched off with merchant ships and sent towards North America. That they might be able to get some elite units here into some of our ports to get control of them. And I'll also remind you what happened in Oakland, California not long ago, where the customs found the Chinese attempting to smuggle 100,000 rifles, 2,000 machine guns, and 100 freight cars of ammunition into the United States. This is an astonishing quantity of ammunition. Now, granted, this is not artillery or tanks or heavy weapons, but it is enough to equip light troops. And if these light troops are supported by nuclear missiles, weapons, or bombers, they might be quite effective in the confusion created afterwards. So there are some suspicious things. Now, as far as heavier weapons, we have all heard these stories about Warsaw Pact equipment being stored in places like Montana. People in the militia getting all excited and taking pictures. And the U.S. government says, well, you know, there's no conspiracy here. We've merely bought this equipment from defunct East Germany, and we're shipping it and we're stockpiling it for whatever later on. Well, it's a rather dangerous thing to stockpile Warsaw Pact equipment deep in American territory where Russian paratroopers might be able to land near it and then go to it and then actually activate it. It's almost like we'd be setting up, stupidly on our own part, the arms caches for the Norway operation, only on a much grander scale. I mean, I don't know the details of these negotiations where the communists sold us this Warsaw Pact equipment, but it could be something rather sinister. Now, once, of course, they establish control in these ports, it is a normal blitzkrieg operation. The interior of the country is bombed. Any large American military unit that forms would not be able to supply itself because they would merely nuke its supply source. And resistance would not extend, they would imagine, beyond 9 months. They would be able to occupy the country, they hope, within 9 months. Now, they anticipate very heavy partisan activity. And Colonel Skirdo, one of the Russian strategist, writes extensively about the partisan activity. He uses World War II as a model. The number of German troops and tanks and airplanes destroyed by partisans is staggering. And the Russians expect that kind of resistance from us. In fact, when I talked to Colonel Alunev, I said, well, couldn't they just nuke us and drop 10 paratroop divisions in northern Canada? You know, it's 130,000, 140,000 men and just march down and take the whole country? He said, no. I said, why not? He said, those paratroop divisions would be dead within 2 weeks. Now that's the impression I got from reading their literature. They do not underestimate us. And that is why they are making all these elaborate preparations. Now, how come our establishment doesn't understand what's going on? Well, this is from the front page of the Los Angeles Times, and it's from 1990, when Germany was reunified, and the West German Interior Minister survived the assassination attempt against him, and he came up with these files. You see, the communists were outmaneuvered by this brilliant man, and he found out where they were keeping their files on all the agents they had in West Germany, and though they tried to murder him and it failed, he survived the assassin's bullet, and lo and behold, they found that there were 5,000 to 6,000 communist agents in West Germany operated by the East Germans alone. That doesn't count what the Russians had, what the Czechs had, what the Poles had, what the Romanians had, what the Hungarians had, or the Chinese for that matter. So, how many are in America? The number one target, if there's 5,000 to 6,000 in Germany. Well, there was a book written about 20 years ago called Inside the KGB, and the author of that book estimated 50,000 East Bloc agents recruited and operating on American soil.